Welcome to ScreenCrush, I'm Arey. I've been taking a lot of questions about Loki on Twitter lately and doing my best to answer any questions related to the MCU and the comics and making educated guesses about what I don't know.
Professor Loki.
But the question I get most is, where did all the variant Lokis come from? It's a fair question because some of these Lokis seem so very different from our Loki, it makes you question what kind of reality created them. After all, there's a troll Loki, a Lance Armstrong Loki, and a woman Loki.
You're a woman.
Yes, I hope that's not a problem.
Episode 3 added even more speculation, with Sylvie talking about remembering her mother.
Tell me about your mother.
I barely remember her. Just blips of a dream at this point.
Well, I've got a theory that I think explains exactly what she's talking about.
First, a quick reminder about what we know about how timelines work in the MCU. First, Professor Hulk gave this very confusing explanation of time travel.
If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future. And your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
Which is a timey-wimey way of saying that your own personal history is already written and that traveling back in time just creates a new timeline. The Ancient One implies this as well when she warns Banner about removing an Infinity Stone.
Remove one of the stones, and that close splits. Now this may benefit your reality, but my new one, not so much.
So when she's talking about my reality, she's referring to her timeline. Like Miss Minute says,
stepping off your path created a Nexus event.
So when there's a sharp deviation from the Timekeeper's plan of the sacred timeline, then it creates a brand new timeline. And remember, the red line is a point of no return. I know a lot of you know this already, but I just think it's important to recap. For the squares.
Now hang on just a minute.
Remember when the Minutemen met Sylvie in 1850s?
Oklahoma.
You know, when I see scenes like this, all I can think is their feet are going to get wet, their socks are going to get wet. Even in this scene, when poor Artax is dying, I was worried about Atreyu's socks. I hate having wet socks and I hate wearing boots in the summer. That's why I'm glad that I found Vessi, the waterproof shoes that are the sponsor of this video. These shoes are a miracle. So I ran a few tests, got sprayed with a hose twice. Look at that dry sock. And now I'm gonna take a piece of paper, write something on it, and then later we're gonna run under a faucet, see what happens. Look at that, still dry. These shoes are 100% waterproof. Not water resistant, waterproof. They're made from Dymatex, a dual climate knit that keeps you cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Now me and Doug are able to take walks in wet grass, and my socks don't get wet.
Are we going on a walk?
Sure thing, buddy. We can go on a walk whenever you want, thanks to my Vessies.
I am happy.
Click the link in the description and enter the discount code to get $25 off your own pair of Vessi waterproof shoes. Back to Loki. Anyways, one of these guards with wet, oily feet says,
"Oil. Think some jackass found himself a time machine, came back here to get rich."
So we know that the TVA doesn't just deal with variants like Loki. They also deal with time bandits.
Nothing can go wrong.
But for them, time bandits are the boring part of the job, just an annoyance. They would rather reset the place than investigate and fill out all the paperwork. This tells me that they deal with small-time crimes all the time. They aren't major crises because they don't display high variance energy. Variance energy, by the way, is an indication of how much change in the timeline will affect the sacred timeline. So, when Loki frees goats at Pompeii, no change. If you were to go back in time, pick a dandelion, and return, very little change. These events would probably not cause a deviation and would likely not even warrant the TVA's attention. After all, time cops hate paperwork.
It's not worth the paperwork. Just prune it, let's bail.
So I think that what the show is setting up is that there are very small alternate timelines, where maybe you had tea at breakfast instead of coffee. Very small alterations that will never branch off and redline. The best metaphor I can give is Mad Max Fury Road. If you haven't seen the movie, don't worry, there are light spoilers ahead. And you should also watch Fury Road as soon as you're done with this video. Alright, so in Fury Road, Immortan Joe's war rig represents the sacred timeline. The War Boys and his other followers represent the human beings who live in the sacred timeline. They're all making individual decisions, like when to blow extra gasoline into their engine and spray their teeth, but for the most part, they stay within the path of Immortan Joe. So, if one of these people were to veer off the path sharply, then they would be on their own. They would no longer be a part of Immortan Joe's war party, they are on their own path, like Furiosa or Nux. When they left the war party, they spun off into their own storylines. They essentially created alternate timelines. After all, we're we're dealing with fiction here, so timeline is really just another word for storyline. Those other Lokis that the TVA has pruned were the protagonists in their own stories, just like this show is following the story of our new variant Loki. When people think of alternate timelines, we tend to go by the Rick and Morty theory, basically that there are an infinite number of parallel dimensions, just like there are an infinite number of potential storylines. So in one alternate reality, Nazis won the war, then another, everyone's a shrimp, Biff Tannen rules Hill Valley, or Amaya is alive. And I think this used to be true in the MCU, when there were multiple timelines before the TVA won the war and created the sacred timeline. But now, alternate realities are simply branches off the sacred timeline created by Nexus events. Alright, so now back to the variant Lokis. I don't think they're from totally separate alternate realities where, say, people are phones and sit in pizza chairs, or everyone is a wasp.
Not all of it.
Sorry, Dad.
Oh, don't be sorry, sweetie. We're all in this together.
All of these individual Lokis represent deviations from a single decision that Loki had made. Loki decides to take Lance Armstrong's place and win the Tour de France. This creates a deviation in the timeline. Loki is transformed into a troll or appears on Earth as a Nordic warrior. These are deviations from the timeline.
By the way, the great comic writer Jason Aaron recently tweeted this panel from Mighty Thor number 3, pointing out that all these variants are present in this issue. Very cool.
Loki decides to rob an Infinity Stone, a major deviation from the timeline, like the Ancient One says.
The Infinity Stones create what you experience as the flow of time. Remove one of the stones, and that flow splits.
But this doesn't explain Sylvie.
Did she turn herself into a woman after being raised a boy? I think the show is going to explain her origin very soon, but I've got a pretty dark theory that I'd like to share with you. Loki's gender is listed as fluid on his arrest form. It makes sense. He's lived his whole life as an illusionist, a frost giant who's Asgardian passing. He was briefly reborn as a woman in the comics after Ragnarok, and in mythology he took on many forms, including women. So let's just say that Loki is able to change his sex at will, but Odin found him as a boy.
In the aftermath of the battle, I went into the temple and I found a baby.
And since Odin clearly favors his sons,
Couldn't stop it, so I'm prisoner. I love you, my sons.
Loki stayed in this form. Maybe MCU Loki doesn't even know that he can change his sex because he's never had to. It's a subconscious ability, like an octopus camouflaging itself. Or like those frogs that they talked about in Jurassic Park.
Some West African frogs have been known to spontaneously change sex from male to female in a single-sex environment.
So what if, while Laufey's dwarf infant son was dying on the rocks, it spontaneously changed its sex and became a girl? It's a decision that Loki made, so it would create a Nexus event. The TVA stepped in immediately since this would be a major change to the timeline.
Sylvie even displays other abilities that Loki doesn't.
I taught myself.
You taught yourself that magic?
Yeah, I did.
So it makes sense that she could learn how to change her form at an early age. Or, look, I could just be overthinking this, and maybe she was just born a girl. So, the TVA has this baby Loki.
You can't put a baby on trial. They don't want to burn the baby alive, so they raise it to be a member of the TVA. That way, she'll live outside of the sacred timeline and can't do any harm. Plus, they prune a lot of Lokis, so it might be good to have an extra one around. But then she betrays them. This explains why Ravonna Renslayer says this is a bad idea.
Trusting this man is not a good idea.
And why others are so harsh to the new Loki.
Let me see the back of that jacket.
It would also explain why Sylvie knows so much about the TVA. She used to work there. She even confirmed in episode 3 that everyone at the TVA is actually a brainwashed variant.
They're all variants, just like us.
Also, she hates being called Loki.
Ugh, don't call me that.
This could be because she was raised to think that Lokis were awful troublemakers who are constantly ruining the timeline. When Sylvie talks about being adopted, she says,
I knew I was adopted.
What? They told you?
Yeah. Did they not tell you?
Now Loki assumed that she's talking about Odin and Frigga. After all, finding out he was adopted was a seminal moment in his life.
So I am no more than another stolen relic.
But what if she's actually talking about the TVA?
They told you?
Yeah.
The TVA raised her, showed her Loki's life, and then taught her to hate and fear other Lokis. There's even a moment where she asks about Frigga.
What was she like?
Do you remember your mother? Your real mother?
Like she's asking because she's never actually met her, and now it's like the memories of her mother have been clouded over.
I barely remember her. Just blips of a dream at this point.
I have no memory of my mother.
She even talks like a TVA agent, like how she refers to the Ark.
The Ark never leaves because it's destroyed.
This is language that sounds like how the TVA perceives time. TVA agents like Mobius see time as movies that they can watch again, and again. that exist on a fixed reel. Like when Mobius says,
"That's the proper flow of time, and it happens again and again and again because it's supposed to, because it has to."
It's very much like Sylvie saying,
"The Ark never leaves because it's destroyed."
At some point, Sylvie discovered the TVA was built on a lie and everyone is a variant. So she escapes with full knowledge of how the TVA and their technology operates. Her goal is to bring down the Timekeepers and destroy the TVA. But the question is, why? Because, as we see at the end of episode 2, she wants to restore the multiverse. But by doing this, she's also going to free the other variants. Then, C20 here will be able to have her margaritas, and Mobius can go back to his jet ski.
There is a beautiful union of form and function, which we call the jet ski.
Now maybe her end goal is to restore her original timeline, so at least some version of herself can grow up as a princess of Asgard. That's her perfect timeline. In my perfect timeline, you can watch Pete and Pete for free on streaming. After all, that show can teach us all a lesson about the dangers of a fascist regime trying to enforce perfection.
Barbecues are supposed to be messy. Eating perfectly is imperfect.
What happens in your perfect timeline? Let me know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Arey.